All right, so last thing in this lecture is to talk about the composition of the plasma membrane itself. So the plasma membrane has four major components to it, and they're going to be discussed in order from most abundant component to least abundant component. Okay? So the first of these components is what's called a phospholipid bilayer. So this is going to be the most abundant component. It's basically what sort of creates the wall that is the plasma membrane. Now, the name of it tells you what it's made of. The phospholipid bilayer is two layers, so it's a bilayer, right? Two layers of these molecules called phospholipids. Now, phospholipids are lipids, which means that they're like fats. So this barrier is made mostly of fat. Now, I won't be able to draw for you the structure of a phospholipid on the board, but you can see them individually in the phospholipid bilayer here. Now let's sort of show it in the picture. So notice this light purple is our plasma membrane, and notice that it kind of has like an extracellular part here, right, facing the outside of the cell, and then it has another part down here facing the inside of the cell. Okay, so this is going to be one layer of phospholipids up here. This is going to be a second layer of phospholipids down here. Now, if you look at just, one of these phospholipids, let's look at this one right here. Notice that it has this ball that faces the fluid, and then these two tails that face the inside of the plasma membrane. So the ball is called the polar head. The two little tails are called the nonpolar tails. Okay? The polar head is water loving. It wants to be with the water that's in the fluid around it. Those two nonpolar tails, nonpolar means they don't dissolve in water. They don't like to be in water. So they're actually oriented so that they face each other rather than facing the water here. And that way everybody's happy, right? The heads that want to touch water are touching water. The tails that don't want to touch water are touching each other, meaning that they're not touching water. Right? So phospholipid bilayer kind of arranges itself normally like this so that these two components of the phospholipid are happy and actually creates this double layer that makes up the membrane like you see here. And you can see this even like in electron microscope images. Sometimes when you look at the membrane will look like railroad tracks. It will look like two little lines because those are the two layers of the phospholipid bilayer. Now, these phospholipids are not bound to each other, so the plasma membrane itself, because of this, is going to actually be very fluid. It's not going to be very rigid at all in general. This is why when people talk about the plasma membrane, sometimes they call how we imagine the plasma membrane to be, they call it the fluid mosaic model, because they want to emphasize that the plasma membrane is fluid because these phospholipids are not bound together. Now, mosaic comes from, the art form of mosaic, making a mosaic. So when you make a mosaic, what you do is you take a bunch of tiny colored pieces of glass or plaster or whatever, and you piece it together to form a picture. So it's going to be a bunch of little inserted pieces. And inside the phospholipid bilayer, that's exactly what we're going to have. You're going to have proteins and cholesterol and carbohydrates kind of pieced together inside this phospholipid bilayer, sort of like a mosaic. And so that's why this is called the fluid mosaic model in general. And some of these proteins that you're going to learn about are going to be stuck in place, but some of them are not. Some of them can actually float in the plasma membrane and move around. Okay? So next are going to be that second component, which are the membrane proteins. They're the next most abundant component. So membrane proteins are proteins that are linked structurally and or functionally to the phospholipid bilayer. There are two types of membrane proteins, what are called integral proteins and peripheral proteins. So the proteins that you're seeing in the image here, at least most of them, are integral proteins. Integral proteins means that they have at least some portion of the protein embedded in the phospholipid bilayer. So these integral proteins can come in three types, and I normally draw a picture on the board, but I won't be able to do that for you here. But you just use the description, and if you have questions, you want to see it drawn out, we can do that maybe in an office hour. Okay? But you have extracellular facing proteins, sort of like this one over here, where the protein doesn't go all the way through. It only is on the extracellular facing side of the phospholipid bilayer. Then you can have proteins like this one right here, which is intracellular facing proteins. So it's only on the intracellular side of the phospholipid bilayer. Then you can have proteins like this one and this one and this one, where notice the protein goes all the way through from the extracellular side to the intracellular side. These are called transmembrane proteins because they pass all the way through the plasma membrane. Now, many of these important integral proteins are going to be things like receptors and channels that you guys will talk about extensively in physiology. We won't really talk about them very much here. Okay? Next are going to be peripheral proteins. So peripheral proteins are proteins that are close to the phospholipid bilayer, but are not actually in the phospholipid bilayer. So the functions of these proteins, so like you can see a peripheral protein here and a peripheral protein here. Okay. Notice that they're not in the bilayer, but they are very close to it and interacting with things that are in it. Okay. Those are peripheral proteins. So the functions of these proteins are linked to the plasma membrane. They're just not physically attached to it. So one example of a peripheral protein that you guys will encounter again, primarily in physiology and beyond, are proteins called G proteins. They're going to associate with receptors called G protein coupled receptors. And those kinds of receptors are actually the most abundant receptor type in the body. And many of the drugs that you guys will administer to your patients will target that specific type of receptor. So next are the membrane carbohydrates. So membrane carbohydrates come in two types, what are called glycolipids and glycoproteins. So the carbohydrates are going to be these green structures that you see attached. So these are, sugars that form these little branching chains, and those sugars can either be attached to a membrane phospholipid, in which case you would get a glycolipid, or those branching sugars can be attached to a membrane protein, in which case you would get a membrane protein. Excuse me, a glycoprotein. So the glyco part of it in the front sort of tells you sugar, like glucose, glucose. It kind of means sugar. Right? So sugar lipid and sugar protein is kind of what these terms mean. Okay? Now notice that these membrane carbohydrates are all going to be attached to the extracellular surface, the extracellular side. You don't see any of them really on the intracellular side. So these sugars on the surface of the cell, notice, make kind of like a forest on the surface of the plasma membrane of all of these sugars. So it's not like a smooth surface. Maybe sometimes we imagine that the membrane of the cell would be a smooth surface. In reality, it's not at all like that. This layer of sugars kind of hanging off here, creating this forest-like surface on the plasma membrane, is called the glycocalyx. Okay, so it's a sugar fibrous extracellular surface of the plasma membrane. And this glycocalyx actually has some important functions. So glycocalyx is important to the attachment of cells to other cells and to surrounding connective tissues. It's also important in cell-to-cell recognition. So whenever you have something covered in sugar, right, and many of you, if you have kids, you know what this is like, right? If your kid has a bunch of sugar on their hands, what are their hands going to feel like? They're going to feel sticky, right? So if you got all these sugars on the surface of the cell, that means the surface of the cell is sticky, and it's going to stick to the other cells or connective tissues around it. Okay? And that's one of the important functions of this glycocalyx. Okay? So it sticks to things. The other is cell-to-cell recognition. So particularly in the immune system, cells have to be able to recognize one another. Immune cells have to go around your body and look at all the cells that it sees or that it encounters and basically figure out, does this cell belong here? Is this cell one of my own, or is it foreign? And one of the things that these immune cells do is they scan the surface of these cells to see, does this cell belong here or not? And so the glycocalyx, like what kinds of sugars are here on the surface, is one of the cues that those immune cells use to tell, hey, this cell belongs, this cell does not. The last and least abundant component of the plasma membrane is cholesterol. So cholesterol is a lipid that has a polar and a nonpolar end, so it's similar to a phospholipid. And they're going to be embedded in the phospholipid bilayer, and that's going to be the little yellow structures that you see. That's the cholesterol embedded in the membrane. So the amount of cholesterol in the phospholipid bilayer is from place to place in the plasma membrane. It's not always going to be in every portion of the membrane. It's usually in specific places where it's needed. And in areas where you have lots of cholesterol, the cholesterol actually makes the plasma membrane more rigid. In areas where you don't have a lot of cholesterol, the membrane is more fluid. Now, this cholesterol is only going to be in the plasma membrane of animal cells. That's why you only get cholesterol in your diet from eating animal tissue, basically from eating beef or pork or chicken. You don't get cholesterol from eating plant-based foods. Last structures are going to be the extensions of the plasma. Oh, sorry, real quick. This is sort of a model of what the glycocalyx looks like. You can also see that model here. And notice it's not like this smooth surface that you typically see, right? It's a very fibrous surface. It's much more like a forest. So you can see an image depicting that. And then this is an electron micrograph right here where you can actually see, notice that the surface of the cells here is very cloudy. It's not smooth. That's the fibrous glycocalyx that you're seeing there. All right, so next are these extensions of the plasma membrane. So these are folds of the plasma membrane of various lengths and with various functions. There are three basic types of plasma membrane extensions, what are called microvilli, cilia, and flagella. So microvilli are going to be the shortest of these plasma membrane extensions. So you can see some of what microvilli would look like here. So notice that the plasma membrane is purple, and notice that it folds to create this extension. You see that? Okay, so these are microvilli. They're the shortest. If you're talking about just one of them, microvilli is plural. If you're talking about just one of them, it's called a microvillus. So these microvilli are going to be non-motile, meaning that they don't move on purpose. You can definitely like brush up against them and bend them over, and they'll pop back up. But they're never going to move on purpose because they don't have any motor proteins. So they're described as non-motile. Right? Basically what they do is they increase membrane surface area. And increasing membrane surface area is particularly important for moving things in and out of the cell. What's called absorption when you move things in, secretion when you move things out. So you see microvilli in particular in places of the body where that transport is important, where moving things in and out is kind of like an important function of that cell. Because that's what the microvilli will allow you to do a little better. The next extension type are cilia, and cilia are going to look a lot like microvilli, just longer. So kind of think of them initially as longer microvilli. Okay? So bigger folds, longer folds. Okay? Now, compared to the last type, they're going to be intermediate in length. So in their intermediate length folds of the plasma membrane. Now, unlike microvilli, some cilia can be motile, some are not. So some can move, some can't. So you have motile or non-motile cilia. So non-motile cilia are often called stereocilia. They contain non-motile cytoskeleton, and so they don't move. And their function is really the same as the microvilli. They increase the surface area to allow the faster transport of things into and out of the cell. But there are, like I said, motile cilia that have motor proteins inside of them, motile cytoskeleton inside of them, and they produce a whip-like motion. And that whip-like motion is used to move fluid around the cells. Right? You'll see these in bacteria as well, and bacteria will use cilia to swim around in their environment, to move around. But that's never going to happen with our cells, right? Because our cells are attached to a bunch of other cells. When these cilia move, you're not going to move all of the cells at once. You're just going to move the fluid that's around the cell. Okay? last plasma membrane extensions are called flagella. So you can see one of those here. So just notice that this is a very extreme fold, a very, very long extreme fold. Now, flagella is the plural term. If you're talking about just one of them, it's flagellum. And if you're talking about just one cilia, it's cilium. Okay, so pay attention to that because you might see that sometimes. Okay? But back to flagella or flagellum. Okay, so these are going to be the longest folds of the plasma membrane. They're going to contain the motile cytoskeleton, so they move. They produce this whip-like motion to propel the cell through, in cellular movement. So this is going to be the only plasma membrane extension that will definitely be used for moving around the environment for swimming. Now, flagellum is really only found in one cell type in the entire human body, and actually only in one sex, in males. Because the only cells that have flagella like this are sperm cells in humans. All right, so let's answer a couple questions here. Which of the following is the most abundant component of the plasma membrane? Now, pay attention to this. Most abundant, okay? Because all of these, or almost all of these, are components of the plasma membrane, right? Cytosol is not. You can eliminate that one. So of the ones you see here, which one is the most abundant? Right, so the correct answer here is B, phospholipid. Phospholipids are the most abundant. If you go back to your notes, remember I listed them in order of abundance, from most abundant to least abundant. So it's phospholipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and then cholesterol in order of from most abundant to least abundant. Next question. Which of the following is the largest body fluid compartment? So remember we talked about this in the beginning of the lecture. Okay. So you might be tempted to say blood plasma. Remember that is not correct. The correct answer, the largest body fluid compartment, is the intracellular fluid, the fluid inside your cells. Okay?